Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and capital forces that are shaping the hard tech startup ecosystem. My name is Justus Kilian. I'm a partner at Space Capital, and we're investing in pre-seed founders. Today, I'm joined by Matt Gjertsen from Better Everyday Studios. Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
And Seyka Mejeur of AdAstra Talent Advisors. Hey, Seyka, how's it going?
Going well, thanks.
All right. Well, great to be back with you guys. It feels like it's been a little bit since we recorded our last conversation, so I'm excited. I'm excited to dive in. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into this one. I think that managing up is one of the most underrated skills in hard tech. And what I'm talking about here is not really about like communicating what you've done and owning your wins and unlocking your career moves, which is really an important skill and like something you should definitely master. But what I'm talking specifically about is the ability for team members to communicate important, urgent, bad news quickly and have that flow up through the organization. And so, whether you're an engineer needing resources or a founder that's needing truth, like this skill is what bridges the gap between vision and execution. I chose this as a VC and an investor because I see a clear pattern of companies that often fail. And it's rarely because they couldn't solve the physics. It's actually sort of this disconnect from the ground truth, from what engineers are seeing and challenges that they're facing with suppliers, to the decision makers and the financiers to rotate and quickly respond to the market or the design challenges. And so I actually think there's a ton of examples in the past that this has been a really important and real problem as we think about startups building more critical systems in our economy, from fission energy to power grid to autonomous vehicles. And so when you look at like 737 Max, there was a Boeing, there was a culture of avoiding bad news. The Challenger explosion was a breakdown in communication from a contractor. And 3 Mile Island was actually a manufacturer report that signaled that there was a issue with the closing taking place and misleading, didn't filter up to the operator. And so I'm excited to unpack this and see if we can like provide some concrete skills and help individuals and teams really sort of develop this muscle. So that's the context, that's the framing. Matt, I wanted to sort of dive in with you. We often train leaders to give feedback, but we rarely train teams to give it back. And so, how do you think about like building a culture where junior engineers feel safe telling a VP, like, I think this is a bad idea?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this question and this topic because I 100% agree with you. It's really important. I was actually just having a conversation with Casey Hanmer, the founder of Terraform Industries, and a lot of the conversation revolved around this kind of idea of just how do you create a culture where people feel comfortable asking the hard questions or telling the hard truths. And I really do think it's a big differentiator and one of those challenges, especially as companies grow. And it's honestly why I think when you ask the question of like how do you train leaders in this, how do you create this kind of culture, the first thing that I think is you're right to say that we do a lot to train leaders in how to give feedback, but I think that's the wrong first step. I think the first step is training leaders how to receive feedback and ask for feedback. I think that's honestly the first thing because so many leaders, I'm sure we've all had conversations where we're sitting down with a boss and they just say, "So, do you have any feedback for me?" And the way those questions are usually posed are just too broad and don't allow for real openness versus asking very specific, hard hitting questions where it's clear that a leader is asking for constructive feedback or constructive criticism. I think is the first step to setting the stage. And so ultimately, I think that's one of the first things that we need to change is when we think about feedback and giving feedback, stop just talking about giving feedback and start talking about how can leaders ask for feedback and receive feedback better, because that's one of the first steps when I think of creating a culture that allows this to happen, because that's usually where it starts, I think.
Okay, I see that. Um,
So interesting. I think something that might be useful to tag in here. My education was in psychology, and we talked a lot about the Challenger. scenario. There are many times in my courses in school that we studied Challenger, and it wasn't an aerospace program that I was a part of, right? But we studied it, and the phrase groupthink is drilled into my bones, right? I understand what groupthink is. It was very, very interesting to me getting into the world of aerospace that's not the same practice in aerospace programs. And I thought, coming out of school, was like, oh, everybody is like beaten over the head with this psychological inclination that humans have for groupthink so that we're aware of it and we're able to fight against it. So I love that we're talking about this, and that you brought up that specific example, Justice. And then, Matt, to your point, it's really what you're talking about is so useful because we do have a natural human inclination to go, okay, this is what we're doing as a herd, right? We're herd animals, and so we're pack animals, and so there's an inclination there, and being able to give feedback, say the unpopular thing, is a skill that has to be honed in many cases.
And I'm really happy you brought up the psychology piece of it, because I do think, since I focus a lot on training leaders, that's of course where my mind goes, of like, how do we create this culture? But kind of probably a bigger or more relevant for a lot of people part of your question, Justice, is what if you're the individual? Like, how do you give upward feedback? And ultimately, I think there's lots of techniques out there, but all of them are grounded in the psychology piece that you mentioned, Seyka. It's trying to understand, if you're trying to give upward feedback and it's not being received, why is it not being received? And thinking about it from a psychological perspective of trying to understand the cues or triggers of your boss so that you can adjust your messaging. Normally, we talk about leaders needing to adjust themselves for the people that they lead, because that's usually the correct kind of order of operations. But for many individuals, if you're trying to get past a leader or get information past a leader, then you need to try to do that same thing and adjust the way that you're speaking or the way that you're communicating for this particular psychology or personality of the person you're talking to.
That's super interesting, and that was the next area I was gonna go. When you have a piece of critical information, you feel like you're hitting a roadblock communicating it up with a manager or somebody who's not receptive. I think sometimes the inclination can be to, like, go around them. Do you think that, like, that's the like, how do you think about making that decision? And like you were just saying, like, you should maybe reapproach it and reframe it based on, like, empathizing or sort of almost like flipping the role and trying to understand why the information is sort of not landing. Can you walk me through like 2 or 3 steps on which you would actually approach this if you have important information to get it to flow up if you're facing challenges?
From my perspective, it's tough, because I think so much of this is so contextual. In a lot of organizations, like SpaceX would be an example, but there's plenty of others that they try to create these kinds of situations where the push is that there is no hierarchy, that it is okay to go across those lines, whereas in other companies it's not okay to cross those lines. And so I think that might change the calculation in terms of when you decide to go around somebody, of how does this look. But kind of the thing you're weighing on is kind of thinking about, in my opinion, it's like thinking about this going poorly, like really understanding, and this is going to depend on how many rungs you jump up, right? If you have this critical piece of information that you think nobody's listening to you and you need to go straight to the CEO of the company with it, in any culture that's going to have implications. And so I think that's the first step, is thinking through what if this goes poorly, and ultimately what that should be doing is helping you double check your work, making sure you truly have an argument that holds water, making sure it's based on data, making sure it is something that the most critical eye will look at and say, like, oh no, we need to act on this. And so I think it's it would be hard. I would be hard pressed to think through like a step by step process that's not contextual, other than really starting by thinking through, what if this goes wrong, making what are all the spears that are going to get thrown at my argument, and why are they wrong and I'm right.
Mhm. That's important to sort of put some weight around the consequence of taking this action and pressure testing it to get to a high degree of confidence that like that's the right next move. Um,
Because it's true that there's any number of things that you can have anybody that's in a big company has seen things they're like, ooh, if that was different, it would totally change the organization. But so often that is really anecdotal. It's just based on personal preferences. And so making sure you're really data backed in your decision to go around people is really essential.
yeah, awesome. Seika, I wanted to sort of shift to you and like see if there's a way to almost test for this in sort of the recruiting and hiring process, right? And so when you think about bringing on a candidate, just any role, like this idea of intellectual honesty, like how do you sort of screen for that and sort of test if somebody already has the innate skill and willingness to sort of speak up if they see a red flag?
Yes, I would love to come back to that. I've got an idea
Okay,
burning
okay,
from what we were
okay.
just talking about, which is it's kind of interesting. We're using both the framing of feedback. We're using the term feedback and also talking about having critical information that we need to pass forward or to escalate. And they feel a little different in my body. I think that sometimes we can think of feedback being you're doing something wrong, which or there's something that you could adjust in your style that would work better for me, right? It's information to give to somebody to adjust how they're behaving. The other is I have information that we need to know to change our direction, and they just feel a little different. We could also carry quite a bit of emotional weight or discomfort in going, hey, I've got feedback to give. This person isn't going to want to receive this. And there might be something that fits that's easier on the system that helps you reach clarity more quickly and it helps the whole process be more fluid if we reframe it as creating clarity for your manager, right? So we're not waiting for alignment, we're manufacturing it. And we're doing that by writing a one pager. Matt, as you were talking about, talk about risks and benefits. We integrate this information, right? Cost and benefit. We don't integrate this information, cost and benefit. And like setting the agenda, this creating speed by doing some of that cognitive work to really create that clarity for that communication, which just may feel, and of course, so context specific, but it may help create some ease by going, my goal here is creating clarity for my manager with really important information. So it was just settling out a little in a unique way for me.
No, I really like parsing that out because feedback is often more personal related and the ability to frame it in the right context to make sure that it lands or about a team dynamic or a need for a resource versus critical information that could affect a team, an organization, an immediate priority, and the ability to absorb that cognitive load to accelerate its path through, can sort of take the onus off of your manager and sort of the upper lines of communication to actually allow it to flow.
Right. Right.
Fundamentally different, fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different. And there's a to be, especially when we're talking about hard tech startups, you have to suspend some of your reservations to follow some of these crazy ideas out into the world, right? That's part of what we're doing is we're finding the yes in a sea of no's. And you're practiced at finding the yes. And so creating clarity for yourself when this is a no that needs to be surfaced, or this is information that's going to pump the brakes when we are a no brake sort of organization, that's hard to overcome, right?
Mm.
And so I also think that there can be some psychological freedom that comes from saying this isn't necessarily pumping the brakes. This may be creating more speed down the line, but we have to have this clarity up front and I have to create this clarity for my manager in order to have us not run into some bigger roadblocks or breaks or traffic jams later on.
I love that.
Sweet. So back to the question that you originally asked me.
Okay.
Sorry.
So this idea
Yes.
of like in the recruiting process, assessing candidates, is intellectual honesty and like will this person actually speak up if they see some sort of red flag or need to escalate information or give critical feedback? How do you test for that? How do you size for that?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. The answer is embarrassingly simple. So, which is kind of fun. So, w- I'll tell you some really explicit questions that I ask practically verbatim. Really wonderful interview question is asking about some of the biggest mistakes that people have made, and you you would be astounded by people that say, "I've never made any." Yeah. That's an actual answer I've gotten more than once. And there are also people now I think this answer comes from reading bad interview advice. Like I don't know, people are out there sharing this and then people are consuming it going, "Oh, that sounds good. Okay, I'll do that." So this bad interview advice is when people ask, "What's your biggest weakness?" or "What's a mistake you've made?" Find something that's actually a success, figure out how to integrate some mistake or error into it so that you're telling a story about how great you are.
I'm
If
just too much of a perfectionist. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
my team loves me too much and right, exactly. I give too much to my company. So, yeah, it's really easy to see through those answers. I think that that actually speaks quite a bit to intellectual honesty, and what I'm really looking for here is, like, can someone talk about a time where they really messed something up? Like,
Yeah.
what did you learn from that? Right? That is a huge part of what we're looking for when we're hiring leaders in hard tech startups. We want people with scar tissue.
Yeah.
We want people
Yeah.
who have made mistakes and are bringing those learnings into the company. And so making a mistake isn't evidence of you being bad at things. Everybody is not great at things. That's how the human experience goes. And learning from that is actually what is going to show us the most. I also ask for moments where telling the truth costs them something, right? So uh, I'm looking for integrity that is, again, showing up in that scar tissue. Who disagreed with you? What costs? What roadblocks did you run into? What chafing happened? And how did you get through that? I also listen for people who are able to tell stories and say, I was wrong. I didn't know that yet. Right? Being able to, showing bravado and acting like everything is, to me, a sign of being pretty green in some areas that we need maturity. And so that's a strong signal for lack of maturity in those zones. And I also watch about how they talk about authority. This is a pretty big one. Candidates who blame leadership for past failures, it's a flag, right? So especially people who held leadership positions in organizations and then are talking about, well, leadership was really changing the goalpost on us all the time. Okay, well, this problem was coming up and leadership was really misguiding us. Candidates who blame leadership for past failures often won't challenge, guide, and create clarity for leadership in the future. The honest ones are talking about how they could have escalated earlier or differently. So if they are a person who says, hey, leadership's changing the goalpost on us, let me walk you through a 10-point plan of how I brought this up, of how I called meetings, how I represented data, how I talked about it with my coach, and then brought it back to them again, right? If you're holding these roles and you're saying leadership was misguiding me, we need to talk about how you, as a leader, were influencing the outcomes. And I think that's a key piece of being able to push back and own the outcomes that you're a part of.
Gosh, I
I
love
I
that.
think I also want to highlight just really how important this is in startup environments, because especially in a startup, the communication norms, communication channels, oftentimes like who's responsible for what, they're not set. They're very flexible. They're still being figured out, and all the way to and that's why all the way to the frontline employees that are being hired with no managerial responsibility, it's really important to be able to test and try and pivot how you're trying to pass information along, because the norms just might not be there yet, and especially in like the earliest of stages. In my experience, I'm actually talking to I'm thinking of a particular company right now. For better or worse, a lot of the decision making is very much a like kind of personality driven, like who can influence who, and it might seem like it's a hierarchy thing, but it's not meant to be that way. It's just that certain people need to be more resourceful in how they're trying to adjust their communication. And so I just think it's important to remember for anybody listening that's joining a startup, not in a managerial role, your willingness and ability to test out and try new methods of communication, everything that Seyka just said is really critical.
Uh, So, Sek, I did want to like take double click on that point, and go a little bit deeper. So, at the companies that you've sort of helped support, like it seems like you've honed these skills, but when they're developing these skills in house, how frequently, or how common is it that they sort of value this sort of authenticity, this sort of introspective or reflective nature of some of the candidates? Does it take them a while to sort of build that into their own process and accept that? Particularly when you're just hiring for people that the first 10, 20 hires, it can maybe be a little bit less formal. It's just like, I just know this person accomplished great things and we've worked together. Let's bring them on. Right. So,
I think it really it each organization is really distinct on this. So there are some organizations where the CEO wants to have a deep conversation to understand the personality profile of each person that they're hiring, and this is a key piece of what they're assessing. There are other organizations where it's really not on their radar. And I think it makes a really big difference in how the organization flows. As you're building out leadership teams, there are some people who have become very good at being an individual contributor. They are able to mentor and influence the other people on the team. And for that reason, they take on more leadership responsibilities, right? There are other reasons that people tend to go into this direction of work. Often being promoted into senior leadership roles, there's a larger thought of pride and ability to make more money and ability to have more influence. I think companies would be well advised to have paths that feel equal in pride and esteem and compensation, one that is for people who are intrinsically motivated by leadership, and one that is for people who are more intrinsically motivated by the tech. Matt, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this, and I'd love to hear it. But the distinction that I want to like draw a kind of fork in the road here is many times at these hard tech startups, people have been promoted because of their technical proclivity toward their skill set, and they have not been honing their leadership skill set. And so we talked a little about the systems that can be put in place by people who are in leadership roles, right? Everybody says that they want transparency, but what are the mechanisms? How are they really getting into the reviews with their team and Matt asking for specific feedback that's going to get them complete information, doing pre-mortems, right? Encouraging written dissent, post-mortems without punishment or praise for giving feedback that is going to cause some slowing down or some reprocessing. So looking for people who have the leadership skill to create those systems is is a whole piece of the puzzle.
okay. You have any thoughts on that, Matt?
No, I think I agree with everything that Seyka just said, because it really is something that, again, it goes back to psychology. It goes back to being pack animals, social creatures. Our brains are designed to help us survive, which isn't necessarily correlated with being correct all the time and like factually correct in the world. And so it all comes back to that understanding of you gotta think about the psychological problems as an individual, whether you're a manager, whether you're an individual contributor, as a way to figure out the best way to communicate. Because it's not, it seems like it should be a natural phenomenon, and yet there's every example that shows it is not a natural state for the correct information to flow through large organizations. It's weird, but it's just not.
I mean, that is a perfect sort of conclusion to maybe like sum up everything that we've said here. So it's not a natural state for information to flow through these organizations. I think one of the key takeaways here is that we recognize that managing up, there can be multiple types of information. Two distinct types that we sort of broke out here is like feedback, which is maybe more personal or team or sort of within your immediate sphere of influence, versus critical or essential information for the organization. And they just have very different processes and methods for communicating them up. And the first one often requires maybe an iterative or an empathetic approach to work with your manager to understand their style and make sure that the feedback lands. The other is more organizational in nature and doing some of that processing to provide clarity around how important this is, how it would impact the organization, why it needs to be escalated so quickly to help it flow more quickly. I think Seika, you highlighted a couple other interesting points that was around how you can actually test for this in candidates, which is around really an authenticity. Like, this is hard tech, so we're looking for people that have worked on hard problems and have learned from those and have taken the steps to think on hard challenges and worked to communicate that up. And past failures weren't just leadership's fault. Being a leader in an organization mean you took ownership of that and tried to help influence and change that. And then I think one of the last things that it's probably worth highlighting is transparency is something people say that they want, but it takes a lot of effort and intentionality to actually make it a reality. And some of that's through systems and designing. And so it matures over time. And so it is an evolution in communication styles and then formalizing of systems. So there's a lot here, but the consequences are very real and significant when we're talking about the world of hard tech and some of the systems that are being built today. And so I appreciate you guys helping unpack that and give our listeners some really concrete ways to develop further.
Yeah. Great question, Justice.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up.